Hi, I'm Josh Obsfeld. I am the Senior Executive for External Engagement for the FBI's Counterintelligence and Espionage Division. Welcome back to another one of our conversations about counterintelligence issues here in the FBI, when we share with you some of the insights that we've learned over our decades of work on this issue in order to inform the public and really educate people so they can properly protect themselves in their day-to-day business, and also just so you all know what we're doing here in the FBI. I'm joined today by Eliza, who's a special agent here with the FBI, and with Tiffany, who's our Senior National Intelligence Officer for counterintelligence purposes. So a great crew that I've got here with me, and I'm delighted to share the mic with them today. And actually, the issue that we're going to be discussing today is really at the core of what counterintelligence does, which is espionage. There are many hostile intelligence activities that our adversaries seek to perpetrate here in the United States, many threats we have to confront. But the oldest and perhaps the baddest thing that they try to do is commit espionage here in the U.S. and steal our secrets. So we wanted to dig into that a little bit and explore what is that? What do we mean by espionage? What is this threat? And how do we go about pursuing it and stopping it from happening? And also, I'm very excited to say that we're going to dive in a little bit on a particular country that is pretty good at espionage historically. That is actually Cuba. So with that, let me turn to Tiffany and get the conversation going. Tiffany, would you maybe just share with our audience a little bit about what is espionage? What do we mean when we say espionage?
Sure. So I think for most of the world, for those who aren't running FBI investigations, espionage boils down to if there's information that some entity is trying to keep secret, and then another entity comes and steals that secret information. So if you're in the sports world and you have a playbook of plays that your team is going to run and an opposing team steals that from you, then that would be, out there in the real world instance of something like espionage.
So they might, launch some kind of intelligence operation, which is a fancy way of saying they'll figure out a way of stealing that, that playbook. And, maybe they'll steal it in some kind of way. They'll, find a copy that's lying around somewhere, but maybe they'll actually find somebody on that opposing team who's willing to give it to them, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, in that situation, what I think there's a lot of myths out there about who's a spy and, is somebody who works at an intelligence service a spy? Maybe we could talk through some of that terminology so that people can understand what we mean when we say spies and espionage and all that stuff.
Yeah. So typically, if we're using the term spy, that refers to the person who's really turning on their team, the person who's committing the betrayal. So, for us, that might be a Robert Hansen and Aldrich Ames. The person who might be handling them or directing their activities, so the person from the opposing team that is, trying to get someone on the other team to give over that playbook, that person is more like the intelligence officer or the handler for that spy. They're doing their job. They're professionally trained, and that's what they are tasked to do day in and day out. They run spies. Now, that person who's running the spy might be assisted by other people who we might call co-optees, who might be people who don't directly work for an intelligence service but respond to taskings from that intelligence officer and might facilitate that relationship. And then some counterintelligence actors also employ non-traditional collectors. And so those folks, again, might not be directly working for an intelligence service. They wouldn't be intelligence officers, but they might be academics or business people who know just the right widget or piece of information to answer their country's intelligence gap. And so they're out there trying to collect that information.
Right. So if they come across something like that, maybe an interesting trade secret or something like that, they might say, hey, if I bring this back over to that other country over there, that country is probably going to pay me some money and help me out. Maybe I'm
Right.
going to go and do that. So they might like go and do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think like the way you define it, espionage really has like a very broad definition. Anytime that somebody has some information in their head or access to it that somebody else wants that they're not supposed to have, not supposed to give up, like that can be espionage. And somebody who would do that, commit that betrayal, wittingly or unwittingly would be involved in some kind of espionage activity. But I know like we have a more strict definition of espionage. And,
Yes.
if we're going to convict somebody of espionage because it is against the law to commit espionage, right, you have to actually do certain things to end up in the crosshairs of the FBI. So could you maybe talk us through a little bit about of that? What does the actual law say, and maybe give us some examples?
So the actual statutory definition of espionage for us comes from the Espionage Act of 1917.
So we're going back.
Yes.
All right. It's been illegal for a long time, though.
Yes. It is transmission. That's the first element. So you have to have transmitted information, which, back in 1917 was more like talking in person. These days, you might be using an encrypted app to transmit information. This is, and I'll go through the other elements, but transmission is often the most difficult to prove because still, in these days, you could just fly over to a foreign country, or you could meet them after dark in a park here in Washington, D.C., and verbally convey information. And to prove that in court, we have to show that, not just say, hey, we think that, this person transmitted this information. Some people make it a little bit easier for us. So Kevin Mallory, who was convicted several years ago, he transmitted national defense information through an encrypted app on his phone, which he voluntarily gave to the FBI, and we were then able to use that at trial to show him, providing classified information to a foreign power.
He was a former CIA officer, is that correct?
Yes. So you have to transmit, and then I kind of already tipped it, but national defense information is what you have to transmit. So in 1917, that predated our current classification regime. So it's not specifically that you have to transmit classified information. It's national defense information. So we have gotten guilty pleas convictions before on unclassified information. So it's often but not always classified. So Mustafa Awad was convicted of espionage 10 to 15 years ago, and that was for giving schematics to some aircraft carriers, and that was not classified, but it was controlled information, and it was obviously relevant to the national defense. So transmission of national defense information to a foreign power or agent thereof, either to a foreign country or foreign power, so it's not always a country. A few years ago, Miriam Thompson was convicted of espionage, and she was actually providing national defense information to Hezbollah, which is, of course, a non-state entity, but is a foreign power and recognized as such by the U.S. government. So you have to transmit it to that foreign power or an agent of them. So an intelligence officer is often the agent of the foreign power.
Like the person who works for their intelligence service,
yes.
right? Like the KGB in the Cold War Soviet Union days.
Exactly, yeah. So that counts as your foreign power. And then the last element is that it has to either or both help the foreign power or harm the United States. So those are both in there so that you can't use as a defense, well, I didn't, give this information if it was, during World War II. Well, I didn't give this information to Germany or Japan, so it doesn't count. No, if you've given it to a foreign power and it's helped that foreign power, we don't necessarily have to prove definitively how it harmed the United States, because it actually does harm us to lose control of our secrets. But if we can prove that it helped the foreign power, then that meets the elements of the crime.
Right. So if I do all that, but I'm, just handing over like a comic book that somebody can find in a store, I don't have to worry that I just committed espionage. That's not espionage.
Correct.
Right?
That is definitely not national defense information.
All right. But there are other forms of espionage. I just in our definition, we spoke very broadly about espionage, but under the law, there's also economic espionage. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? I know we're probably not going to spend a lot of time on that in this conversation right now. We'll hold that for a later date. But maybe just talk us through like a little bit about what that is. And then
Sure, yeah. So that's under a different statute than counterintelligence or traditional espionage.
Still something we take very seriously here in the Counterintelligence and Espionage Division in the FBI, but yes, a very different sort of set of statutes.
Yes, still worked by the Counterintelligence and Espionage Division, but traditional espionage, the Hansons and Ames of the world, economic espionage is where you have information that is controlled somehow. So it might be intellectual property, trade secrets, and that is stolen and given to a foreign power by some entity. So it doesn't have the national defense information bit to it, but still you're looking for transmission of information that is somehow closely held or controlled by an economic entity.
Right. And we actually did recently have a case of this. We had an employee of Google that had access to information that was proprietary and protected by Google about artificial intelligence, which obviously is like a really critical, important technology that we're trying to protect. And this individual tried to take that information back and bring it over to China. In this case, the person was stopped. We did identify this person ahead of time. We're able to keep the information here. The person was arrested and recently convicted of economic espionage. So that is very much something that we pursue and obviously very important. So, with that, I wanted to maybe dive in a little bit, Eliza, on a particular country that actually had a lot of success in the espionage game for a long period of time. It's a country I think that many people perhaps don't think about out in the public when it comes to espionage and intelligence, but it's certainly a country that we think about a whole lot, given how dangerous they are and how successful they've been, unfortunately, and that is Cuba. So, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the history of the Cuban intelligence threat and how we came to understand it as it is before we get more into the espionage piece of it.
Trying to do Cuba intel services in 2 minutes is going to be challenging, but the bottom line is Cuba has punched well above their weight for a long time. For such a small island, they have really been a thorn in our side because they're really good at what they do. Given their proximity to us, in the Caribbean and the fear of invasion, really, quite frankly, they see the U.S. as an existential threat. They've always been worried that we were going to invade. They've always wanted to get ahead of that. So they've put a lot of time and effort into getting information. They also have worked really hard to influence policy and do everything they can to figure out what it is the U.S. is doing. And they've done that by investigating in their intel services to the point where we didn't realize how good they were until it was almost too late.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about that. I know, for a long time we didn't maybe focus as much on Cuba, really until I think like the late 80s, which, I think none of us here at the table were working at the FBI at that point, certainly before our time. But it was I think in the late 80s that we recognized Cuba as the threat that it is. And, what were some of the seminal events that led to this sort of sea change in our understanding of the threat?
Usually it takes basically realizing that you have a problem.
Right.
And there were two big ones. The first one was in '87. We had a defector, Florentino Aspiaga, who came to us from Cuba and basically told the U.S. intelligence community that all our agents were doubled, which basically means they were controlled by the Cuban government. And that was a gut punch. Right. Because all the information that we thought we were receiving and controlling was basically being fed to us by Fidel Castro through the intel service.
So here we are as a U.S. intelligence community, and this guy who kind of works sort of like for the equivalent of the FBI comes over to us and says, hey, like how you've recruited all these sources, we're actually a lot better at counterintelligence than you think. None of them are actually truly spying for you. Like you think that they're spies, just like we described, but they're not. They're really just telling you what we want you to hear. Right. But of course, at this point, Aspiaga is now working for us.
Right, correct. So that was a huge kind of wake-up call. The other part of that piece is not just that's kind of our forward-leaning offensive operations was the penetrations. And that essentially means basically that they penetrated our government. And that's basically what, we've been talking about here, is trying to figure out who the spies are. And we heard whispers that our government was penetrated by a network of agents that the Cubans referred to as la red, which means network in Spanish. And that was essentially how we woke up and started realizing that we had a problem.
So this is a little bit after that, right? Like maybe early 90s. We learned from a variety of different places that, hey, it's not just that they have doubled up all of our spies and turned them into double agents. Actually, it's a lot more than that. They have recruited a lot of spies in our government, and those we have not identified. Those are not double agents. So what happened then?
The FBI, the U.S. intelligence community, started to take Cuba more seriously. We worked to change some of those things, increasing our operational security, working to obtain more information, and through a process of starting to hunt down La Red. And the way we did that, we worked together with our partners, and this is, all the folks that came before me, put these pieces together, and we had bits and pieces of information, and through those we were able to investigate and eventually identify different individuals that were part of that network. And we came to understand, we say network, but really it was just a loose group of students who had been recruited either while a student or teaching at Ivy League universities, who had some kind of ideology or held the Cuban Revolution as something aspirational, and the Cubans pounced and took advantage of that and recruited these folks well before they ever entered the U.S. government, which makes them challenging and hard to find. By the time we came to figure out who they were, they had been working in the government and well placed for a long time, which makes our job even harder. And that's how we put the pieces together and started figuring out who these individual players were.
Right. So the Cubans were able to recruit people before they even worked in the government, which is certainly planning ahead, right?
Correct.
And I think you said that they used ideological motivations too. So there wasn't even really much of a money trail here, right?
Right, absolutely.
For these people, and then they successfully got them into government, and once there. They start sharing information with the Cubans that hits all the categories that Tiffany just mentioned before. So that sounds really challenging, and this happened. At least we learned about it quite a while ago. Why does it take time to find these people? I mean, I think we just hinted at some of the issues and the challenges, but maybe you could unpack that a little bit more for us.
Well, because it's never, these cases are never neat and complete. We always get pieces of the puzzle. We never, unfortunately, get the first name because then it would be, case solved. It's usually bits of information that we have to put together and figure out who these folks are. I think probably the most well-known case would be Ana Montes. That's the DI analyst that we figured out in the 90s. And by piecing together, we had bits of information. We had HF, which is high-frequency messages. This is the Cubans sending messages to Montes in the States, and some of our handlers. We were able to piece that together and put together a list to figure out data points that we eventually led to her. We were able to do something similar with Walter Kendall Myers and his wife. He was working at the State Department. He came about a decade later. And so essentially just putting a lot of work, putting these pieces together to figure out who these individuals are. Right. And then lastly, or most recently, we were able to do the final piece of this network, which was Victor Manuel Rocha. He was an ambassador, and he was sort of the last hanging chad in this group of penetration agents.
Well, he was the last one that we found, right?
Absolutely, yes.
The last one that we got to.
Right.
But I think, just to pull that out a little bit, this is a network that was in existence for a while, and it just took time for us to work through the information that we had, and also to get more information.
Yes.
When we have this incomplete picture, it's not like we sit around and we just,
Right.
say, woe is me, right? We work actively to try and find more and more information,
Right.
so we can identify positively who this person is and take action. But I think it's also really important to note, and maybe Tiffany, you could also help us pull on this string a little bit. Espionage spies are the hardest thing for us to find, right? Because they are the most prized possessions of any intelligence service.
Yeah, I mean, our adversaries, when we're talking about the Counterintelligence and Espionage Division and the field offices that run the cases, these adversaries are the most sophisticated actors in the world. Like, we're talking about whole governments, or, you know, in the case of something like Hezbollah, a very state-like entity that's extremely sophisticated. They have entire apparatuses dedicated to keeping the identities of these people secret. And oftentimes, because these are people who hold clearances themselves or have held clearances themselves in the past, depending on exactly what type of work they've done, they may know extremely well the guardrails that we have in place and how we run these investigations. So you add in that knowledge as well, where they try to keep themselves secret and keep their identities, keep their activities secret. So it's extremely challenging. We're not, you know, trying to find a 16-year-old who stole a car.
Right.
We're going up against an entire government. And in the case of Cuba, it may seem like a small government, but one that's received training and resources from the Soviet Union through, you know, to today.
Right.
So.
Right. And one that puts all their resources into their intelligence services, no matter what they're going through. You know, when in the 90s, they were going through the special period, they lost all their Soviet subsidies, yet their intel services were funded. You know, now people question, well, what's going on with Cuba now, you know, their economy, but it's going to be the same thing. And I think what makes Cuba so successful, aside from the fact they're able to play the long game, is kind of what I'm hinting at here, is that by recruiting students young and before they even touch a government workspace, you know, we usually look for espionage indicators. That's something we talk about often, right? Looking for when a person's turned, if there's something going on in their life, changes in finances. There's a whole list of them. But with these folks, they've come into government already recruited, already motivated. There's no changes. They're legend. They're living their life. They're living their legend because they fully believe. And so it makes it very, very challenging. And it's one thing that, you know, we know a lot about now because of this, their successes with sort of this long-term recruitment. It's also helped us sort of prepare because we also know that this wide net, this going after students, going after academics, and sort of just casting a large, wide net of anybody who could have access and potential is amazing. Because I always joke, I couldn't imagine going to my boss now and saying, you know, I'd like to recruit this 20-year-old because I think there's
That's
something.
what they do.
There's a payoff there.
Right. So, you know, these individuals you just mentioned, you know, Myers, Montez, Rocha, right? They were out there for a while, and they were out there for some time, and it took us some time to find them. Can you maybe like talk us through a little bit of that? And you know, I think just a point that is really important to note is that though these individuals are so prized by our adversaries, and here in particular, they're prized by the Cuban government because, you know, they were their lifeline in a way. You know, they're worried, the Cubans were worried about being attacked, and they're hoping that these individuals will tell them ahead of time if something's going to happen, if something's up, or can maybe even influence things a little bit to make sure that doesn't happen. So clearly, like these spies are super important for them. Yet we did find them. You know, the FBI found all of these individuals. So, you know, for one thing, and I'm going to talk to the audience out there, you know, your FBI is out there trying to find these individuals, but also, you know, nobody should think that just because a foreign service offers you protection that the FBI will let you go and that you'll get away with it. Because if the Cubans couldn't protect their spies, then honestly, nobody's going to be able to protect you from the FBI. But maybe you could just talk through a little bit of the process and maybe some like lessons learned, if you have any for us.
Well, like I was alluding to earlier, is we never get the full name, we never get the full picture. We get pieces of this puzzle that we have to figure out, and this takes a team of investigators. Luckily, we work together really well with our partners at various agencies, and with our analytical team. You know, you guys are a great example of that.
Yeah, I'm an FBI analyst actually, so thank you for that.
Because it's a lot of sifting through information. It's a mole hunt because we get tidbits of information, and you have to figure out who matches it. And a lot of times, in hindsight, it seems very obvious when you have the person.
Yeah. So Tiffany, I wanted to turn back to you and ask maybe, you know, what are some takeaways for us based on the, you know, the Cuban threat, the Cuban, experience, and just in general from your, you know, expertise on the subject in terms of espionage and, you know, how to prevent it and maybe what people should be aware of out there in the public?
Yeah, so I think maybe the overriding theme is espionage is extremely difficult. It's difficult to investigate, but it is something that the FBI is extremely dedicated to solving. And when we get a lead, as Elisa mentioned, it could be as fragmentary as what kicked off the Rocha investigation, and for decades we were dedicated to trying to solve that mystery because it matters for our national security. I think also from some of the other Cuba cases, you can pull out some patterns like family members being involved in espionage. So the Myerses, that's something that is relatively rare, but it's not unheard of. So Jonathan Toby and his wife is another more recent example of a couple engaging in espionage acts together. So that's something that we can be on the lookout for. And I think also, as Elisa mentioned, like the motivations for this can be so complicated. It's not just like, oh, this person, suddenly has financial difficulties or they're disgruntled with their job. It could have been a seeding operation where the person came in always knowing they were going to be a spy. So we very much talk in terms of indicators versus something being diagnostic. Because, again, with the Cuba example, as you mentioned, people typically aren't getting paid huge sums of money by the Cubans. So, just looking for people with financial problems who need help solving them, you're not going to find Cuban spies. So we have to assemble all those puzzle pieces and try and put them together. But also, I think just making sure that we remain aware, which I think the FBI does a good job of, not to underestimate actors. So whether that's a country like Cuba or other, countries outside of the normal ones that you would expect, when people are dedicated to finding out our secrets, when it's an existential threat for them, they're going to put resources behind it. But then also, remaining aware as far as the subjects that we're investigating. We have to be very careful not to dismiss, like, oh, well, that person, he was just a diplomat in the 80s. He doesn't know how to be a spy. He wouldn't, it wouldn't be him. We need to look for somebody, who worked for an intelligence agency. We have to keep our minds open and see where the facts take us.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to pull out is that we mentioned that these spies were recruited, the Cubans were recruited when they were quite young, right? And I think that, if I'm out there and I'm a member of the public, right, and I think to myself, hey, like, I may have access to information that somebody's interested in, or, maybe I don't yet, but it's possible that somebody might try to manipulate me. Just have my senses up. I know that, Rocha in particular said to us that he felt like he had been manipulated early on, and maybe if he had been older, he would not have made the decisions that he made. Whether he's sincere or not, I think it's an important point for us all to remember that people are impressionable, and the people, the intelligence officers who work for the foreign intelligence services, are very skilled and qualified at manipulating that and manipulating people to get them to do things that may not be in their interests. So it's worthwhile for people just to sort of have their guard up. Yeah. Just any very quick closing thoughts that either of you have before we round this one up?
I think just, try and toe that line. Not you don't need to be paranoid, but be aware, and you can always run, if something seems not right to you, you can always run it by your company or agency security office, and they're pretty good at separating the wheat from the chaff. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you to our audience who joined us today. There are a lot of resources out there and available on espionage and also on insider threat programs, and resources to help people just sort of maintain awareness of these issues and make sure that they are being cautious in who they're talking to and what they're talking about. So I really encourage you to explore all of those. I want to thank Elisa and Tiffany for joining me today. I really appreciate it. It's great to just spend some time with you and chat about these issues. And with that, I hope you'll tune in to the next in the series of this as well. And thank you all for joining us.